Why do we give ourselves away just to keep the peace? Why do we twist ourselves into knots, trying to be liked, approved of, and seen? And why is it so hard to say no? In today's episode, I'm unpacking the people-pleasing persona through the lens of astrology. So I'll explore the psychology behind it and where it tends to come from, and then how it shows up through archetypes that crave harmony, disappear into service, and chase validation. So if you've ever wondered about the astrology of people-pleasing, stick around, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Welcome. This is a space for curious minds, meaning seekers, and anyone drawn to the deeper layers of astrology and the human experience. So to start off with, I'll look at people-pleasing as a psychological pattern and what's going on beneath the surface. Then I'll dive into how this shows up astrologically through signs, planets, and houses. And then lastly, I'll look at what these archetypes reveal about our coping mechanisms and unconscious strategies, plus a few reflections on how we can start to shift these dynamics and begin healing the core wounds underneath. So most of us relate to people-pleasing, but for some people it can go to a much more painful place. It becomes a continual pattern of always putting yourself last, prioritizing other people's approval over your own needs, or just taking a back seat in your own life. Carl Jung described the people-pleaser as somebody whose identity is overly fused with their persona, which is the mask we wear to be accepted by others. So for the chronic people-pleaser, that mask becomes so dominant that they completely lose touch with who they are, and the barrier between themselves and others becomes much less defined. People-pleasing can look the same from the outside, but the drive behind the behaviour will vary depending on the person's nature, but also the environment that they grew up in. So let's start with the martyr. The martyr likely grew up in an environment where their needs were an inconvenience or completely dismissed. They would have only been praised for being good, quiet, or helpful, while the adults around them were likely dealing with dysfunction or emotional volatility. So the martyr internalized the message that love was earned through self-denial and being helpful to others. So in the zodiac, the sign that best corresponds with the martyr is Pisces. Pisces is a mutable water sign that's ruled by Jupiter. So it has this very fluid, emotionally vast nature. Its energy is adaptive and boundaryless. So you could say that at its core, its impulse is to surrender and merge with its environment. But unfortunately, the shadow side of these Piscean qualities means that they can lose themselves in other people. Pisces is also a natural healer, so it subconsciously absorbs negative emotional energy around it, but it can also lead to mistaking that energy for its own. Because of this deep emotional empathy, Pisces can fall prey to energy vampires and emotionally toxic dynamics, because those types of people feed off of the Piscean kindness and sensitivity. This pattern can lead Pisces to repeated victimhood, where their underlying desire for unity and transcendence becomes like a form of ultimate sacrifice. Each planet in Pisces will reflect the martyr archetype in a variety of different ways. But when it comes to the malefic planets, Mars and Saturn, there is a higher possibility of the energy intensifying and becoming more self-destructive. For example, Mars in Pisces has a kind of Joan of Arc energy where it expresses itself through the form of spiritual courage, emotional resilience, and a capacity and willingness to suffer for what they perceive as something greater than themselves. It's the Mars warrior expressed through devotion and sacrifice. Because when Mars energy is filtered through Pisces' watery emotional vastness, it can easily slip into a sort of self-erasure, where the ego identity becomes diffused and wants to merge with the collective. Whereas Saturn in Pisces is more likely to create a sense of guilt around actually having boundaries. It reinforces the belief that suffering is necessary for connection, or it can have self-inflicted pressure for sacrifice, which inevitably leads to resentment. Another strong signature of the martyr archetype is the astrological 6th house, which is strongly associated with sacrifice, toil, and service. Planets in the 6th house strengthen the drive to to be of service, and so overfunctioning can become a defining trait, especially if it's connected to relationship dynamics. There's something interesting about the way that the 6th house relates to the 7th house of relationships, because planets in the 6th are actually striving towards the 7th for connection and completion. But the planets are caught in a kind of holding pattern, continually being brought back away from the 7th, reflecting the acts of repeated cycles of service without ever reaching true union. This creates a feeling of yearning and self-neglect, which often looks like burnout or quiet resentment. In the tarot, the card that best aligns with the Martyr archetype is the Hanged Man. The Hanged Man represents surrender, sacrifice, and suspended agency. So the shadow side of the Hanged Man archetype is somebody who's stuck in limbo, believing that suffering is something noble or necessary. There's a spiritual Piscean undertone where it communicates a sense that giving up control is meaningful or even redemptive. But in its shadow, it becomes servitude disguised as virtue. Next is the Diplomat. Now, the Diplomat tends to be the emotional barometer of the family. They usually take on the role of the peacekeeper or the go-between, where they're constantly trying to maintain some kind of emotional or psychic balance between the people around them. They likely grew up in an environment with a lot of emotional inconsistency and hypersensitivity, where expressing anger and having strong opinions just led to guilt trips, shutdowns, and punishment. So they learn to keep things smooth, stay agreeable, and let go of their own autonomy just to avoid conflict. So the Diplomat learned that safety comes from staying balanced, keeping the peace, and keeping others happy. In the zodiac, the sign that best corresponds with Diplomat is, of course, Libra. Libra is a cardinal air sign ruled by Venus, so it's associated with adaptability, harmony, and reason. Libra is deeply relational, so it seeks connection as one of its core impulses. And because Libra is ruled by Venus, that impulse expresses itself through agreeability, refinement, and the need to make sure all sides are being heard. This can also be seen in the sign Taurus, which is a fixed earth sign also ruled by Venus. But with Taurus, it seeks harmony and balance as a way to maintain stability and predictability. Taurus is represented by the bull, so it's actually a symbol of power itself. But this can also lead Taurus to being sacrificed at the altar of atonement, where they take on the sins of others as a form of purification. So these Venus shadows revolve around codependency, conflict avoidance, and an inability to assert their own personal needs. The 7th house of relationships can also be a strong indicator of people pleasing because of its focus on contractual relationships. So planets here can become enmeshed in relational dynamics like entanglement, perpetual compromise, and self-neglect. Because the 7th house of relationships sits directly opposite the 1st house of the self, there's often a tension between self-assertion and social preservation. For example, people with the sun or the moon in the 7th house are more prone to focusing on their relationships at the expense of themselves and will sometimes make their relationships the centre of their lives. In the tarot, the Diplomat corresponds well with the Temperance card. The Temperance card represents moderation, emotional balancing, and the alchemical blending of opposites. But in its shadow, it reveals the cost of always tempering yourself and staying emotionally regulated for the sake of other people. The aim is always equilibrium, but that usually comes at the expense of their own needs. So finally, we have the Performer. The Performer comes from a home where love and attention was usually conditional and was usually based on superficial achievements or social validation. Their parents or caregivers likely placed high value on appearance and reputation, but their emotional world was often ignored, while their external successes were being rewarded. So the Performer learned to be a high achiever and a perfectionist, always seeking external validation to prove that they're worthy of love. I think the shadow side of Leo mirrors this quite well. There's a regal quality to Leo that comes with a deep desire to be seen and appreciated. As a fixed fire sign ruled by the sun, Leo represents centrality, radiance, and identity. But there's also a paradox here, because the sun is the centre of the solar system and the giver of life, yet its whole existence is defined by other planets orbiting around it. This creates a dynamic where the need to be fed attention is how the shadow Leo survives, and without it they feel empty or invisible. Leo gives generously and it's a powerful source of vital energy, but when it's wounded it can become overly reliant on outside validation, completely forgetting that it's the source of light for everyone else. At its core, the performer archetype comes from a lack of self-worth and the mistaken assumption that approval is the only way to feel seen and loved. This dynamic also shows up in the 4th and the 10th house axis, with the 10th house being the most visible part of the chart and the 4th house being the most private, emotional and hidden. So the roots of the 4th house can shape what rises to the surface in the 10th house, and so unresolved family patterns or unmet emotional needs can often rise into their public life, almost as an attempt to find validation that they think they need through performance, success, or social striving. So you could say that whatever's unresolved in the 4th house tends to echo through the 10th house, especially if it's left unchecked. In the tarot, the performer corresponds best with the star card. The star speaks to hope, visibility and being chosen, but also to projection and idealized identity. It's not that the performer is prideful, it's that they're yearning to be seen and validated through how they appear, and the star card reflects the deeper longing to be admired and the fear of being ordinary and forgotten. So the people-pleasing dynamic can show up in so many different ways. And what I love about astrology is that it can give us the language to explore it from multiple angles. I truly believe that when we see our patterns through symbols and archetypes, we create just enough distance to observe them objectively but compassionately. And once we can observe them, we can start to understand them and eventually begin to transform them. So here are a few questions to pose to your own people-pleasing archetype. For the Martyr, what part of you believes you have to suffer to be loved? And who would you be if you stopped rescuing others? For the Diplomat, why do you believe that it's your job to keep the peace? And what would it look like if you let other people have their conflicts without stepping in to mediate? And for the Performer, are there parts of you that you constantly repress because you feel they won't be approved of by others? And who are you when no one's watching? So these are my 3 people-pleasing archetypes. Let me know in the comments which one resonated with you most, or if you have your own take on the people pleaser. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode of this series, where I dive into more psychological patterns through the lens of astrology. I also offer private readings, so if you want to go deeper into this pattern in your own chart, you can book a session through the links below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.